It's not finding the extra bit of data. That data is, I guarantee you, well discounted, well assessed, well traded upon. If it's been put into a quantity, it's already over. In Western culture, there's almost no appreciation for wisdom as a concept. By the way, there's an investment secret. Find those people whom you trust and, allocate capital to them.
Basically, we're always working.
You nailed it. It's like, why did I retire? Like your primary mindset was investment, 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 investment. There's information everywhere. Some of the world's best business evaluators, they always miss the mark. Can I witness my own mind thinking? In The Intuitive Investor, in the latter half of the book, I have a framework for that, which is stolen from Buddhism. And in a lot of the new age spiritual community, they think it's enough to just like have the mindset, the inspiration, the imagination, the thoughts about it. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm really committed to becoming a billionaire, but there's no deeds undertaken on behalf of that. And so they just sit there hoping that by thinking good thoughts, all of a sudden magic happens. In my experience, it doesn't happen. That fun stuff actually is investing. That's a really hard thing to do, what you just asked me to explain. I will explain it, and then it's really simple to place into your mind's eye, Alcoa, Boeing, Corning. You'll feel yourself start to become that thing. And there are times in my career, I'm like, oh my God, as I tune into the feeling of the market, I feel nauseous. I feel like I'm about to throw up.
So you've been preparing for that by being in a meditative state. How does one spend the entire afternoon in a meditative state? You just harmonized with me, man, because that was exactly the question I was going to ask. How did you know that?
Analytical minds that try and evaluate whether AI has gained consciousness, it'll look like and it'll check all the boxes, but it won't be capable of the inspiration state of awareness. Because most people are on autopilot. And you look at the great successful companies, it's because they create habits of belief in their customers. What's your denominator? What's driving the decision? What's the mental model you're using? I conducted, in conjunction with criminal justice professionals, history's first research into the convergence of finance, investing, and deception science.
And no one wanted anything to do with it. I think that more than anything, it's a fear of being replaced.
A great question that you've just asked. I think we are literally at the very nascent beginnings of a capability that we've never had before. There's no reason you couldn't measure an executive's anxiety. The die is cast. Once the genie is out of the bottle on these things, it's not getting put back. People may fight it tooth and nail. The genie's out of the bottle on that one. It's basically over.
And the challenge of that's going to be finding meaning.
So you nailed it. At a certain point, that is going to become unpalatable to huge parts of the population, because no matter how hard they work, no matter how much they meditate, no matter how inspired they are, their benefit economically will be capped.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Javier with the Real Javier Novoa, and today it is my honor and pleasure to bring to you the full interview with Jason Apollo Voss, the author of The Intuitive Investor and the CEO of a company called Data, or Deception and Truth Analysis, which is a company that applies state-of-the-art programming to detecting patterns of deception in the writings and speeches of corporations, and therefore to guide investment decisions. And I'm coming to you today because despite my best efforts in editing, I was not able to get this video under 1 hour. And most of my videos I try to keep under 1 hour. Most interviews, most of them I try to keep them under 30 minutes, because I know from YouTube and from the algorithm that people are just not going to stay with a video, no matter how good or how profound, for that long a time. But I just want to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, this is probably the best, the deepest, the most profound, the most knowledge-packed interview that I've ever done. It stands alone as a masterclass in investing, in living, in harmonizing, and so many other topics. I encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, it is to your benefit. If you can't watch it today or now, set aside a time and watch this interview all the way through. You're going to have incredible insights. You're going to be introduced to one of the greatest modern day investors, Jason Apollo Voss. So thank you so much for watching, and stay through, watch the video. I know you're going to enjoy it. So now let's go to the interview with Jason Apollo Voss. This is Javier with the Real Javier Novoa. Today we have one of the figures who have influenced me in a very profound way. It's Jason Apollo Voss. He is the author of this book right here, The Intuitive Investor, A Radical Guide for Manifesting Wealth. And this book has been close to me for many years, like physically close. I've returned to it, I've journaled in it, and I've read it. Mr. Voss is a very precocious individual. Precocious meaning he started young. He retired at the age of 35 officially, and that was probably before I made my first serious investment. So the first question I'd have for you, Mr. Voss, is when was your first investment? And by investment, I mean like stock investment. Because I know in your book you have a much more broad definition of investing.
It was good of you to make that distinction, only because I was about to launch into, well, Javier. And by the way, you can call me Jason. I appreciate the formality, but I'm an informal person typically.
Sure, Jason.
Yeah, and so that's a good question. I think it was in the mid 1990s, and I don't even remember what it was. So I started my career in the mid 1990s as a stockbroker, which was a role I did not enjoy particularly well. And I remember as a 23-year-old, 4-year-old, like seeing my peers who were also stockbrokers invest, and there were stocks that at the brokerage firm I worked at that they promulgated and promoted, and I think it had to be one of those. There's something in the back of my mind that had to do with like a laser company, like in the nascent stages of a laser, but I don't really remember, to be perfectly honest. I know it didn't do very well. Like at that moment, I hadn't learned a lot of the skills necessary, I think, to become a good investor, and was relying upon, all the popular, what's the right word, all the atmospherics around the investment business, to make decisions. And it didn't help that I was working as a stockbroker, because there are a lot, that's ground zero for the atmospherics of the business. And so I think my mindset, and I say it in The Intuitive Investor, has always been that of an investor. Like understanding and essentially being an investor is about deferred gratification. It's recognizing that, hey, if I sacrifice right now, in exchange, I have a much bigger, brighter future than if I act now impulsively. And that's really the mindset. And I've always, for whatever reason, had that.
Did you begin studying spirituality from a younger age, perhaps in your teens? And did that inform at all your formative stages in investing, in what we call stock investing?
No, not at all, actually. And there are going to be two threads here that I have to unite back together at the end. And at the end is chronologically, right? So we're going to start way back in ancient history in the mid 70s. I remember having an experience, and if you look at the acknowledgments of the book, I thank the Rolling Stones for Gimme Shelter, that song. And the story behind that is I remember my mom receiving a long distance phone call circa 1977. And by coincidence, several weeks earlier, she had shown me how to put records on a record player, like vinyl records. And I was just looking through the record collection because I was like, okay, long distance phone call. She's going to be checked out for like an hour. Like, what am I going to do? And I put on side 3, track 1, Gimme Shelter by the Stones. And I didn't know anything about the Rolling Stones. And I remember like Gimme Shelter came on. I was like, wow, what is this craziness? And I started running around in circles as like a 7-year-old. And I had this kind of transcendent mystical experience. And I didn't
Wow.
think to myself, oh, I've had a mystical experience. I didn't think to myself, oh, I've been meditating, for the last, 10 minutes. But I kept playing the song over and over again. I thought it was about the music. And that essentially was a meditative practice, though, and this is the second and parallel thread, my mom is an atheist, right? And so there wasn't really permission in my household to have a spiritual experience. So the language was really strange. I'd be like, I called it becoming introspective or going introspective. And then I had a girlfriend in high school who was a meditator, had her uncle train her in meditation, and she'd call me on the phone and be like, can I call you back? I'm going to go introspective. And at one point she's like, what is this going introspective? And I told her about going introspective, and she goes, you're meditating. I'm like, no, I'm definitely not meditating, because I didn't have permission for that word and that concept. And she's like, well, you are, and let me show you like a formal practice. And so she was the first person to show me a formal practice. And I put that in air quotes because I was already meditating. I just didn't know it. So there was this spiritual thread throughout my whole life, but I didn't start to give it permission until like my late teens. And then it became, a very formalized part of, what I did. And as you know, because Punchline, the intuitive investor was essentially written to acknowledge these experiences, these states of consciousness, which I think are super informative to an investment process.
And a lot of people in this field, it seems like, have it. Like I was talking with our mutual friend Kim Curtin, the fact that, like, if you read even Peter Lynch, if you read about George Soros, they all have sort of an intuitive spiritual practice, but they wouldn't probably label it as such. Like George Soros said, he trades based upon a pain in his back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like this. So I think what you do in the intuitive investor is just make it conscious, and that's why it's such an amazing book. And you sort of give a series of steps, or shall we say, a framework for it.
Yeah. And by the way, I'll interrupt it only because Ray Dalio is also, one of those people, and he's
Yeah,
very explicit about what he does and is a huge proponent of meditation as a practice for investment professionals. And Javier, I totally agree. Every time you scratch beneath the surface of the truly great investors, you'll see that they have some form of, they wouldn't necessarily call it meditation because again, they don't necessarily have sat down and had a formal practice, but they have a way of tapping those states of consciousness, which we'll call non-linear, right? That's a safe word if you're coming from a scientific background. Irrational, right? And irrational, oftentimes scientist types, very analytical types label that as a bad word. There's no reason for it to be a bad word. It just means the states of consciousness where interesting things happen that can't be codified, named, described, and all of a sudden you just have a direct knowing of stuff and you don't know why. And by the way, I've been working on forever a second edition of the Intuitive Investor, where I've
wow.
logged and recorded like 40 stories from the great scientists throughout history. And it took me years to track down the stories around those discoveries. And almost all of them, if you track down what was going on in their lives at the time, they had like a transcendent kind of mystical experience when all of a sudden the periodic chart of the elements appeared in Kerkelei's mind. And Einstein and talking about, the discovery of relativity, same thing. And so these are important parts of consciousness and good thinking, but most people in the modern world don't really have permission or grant themselves permission, nor do they have a framework. And ergo, the whole reason I wrote The Intuitive Investor was to be the counterweight to the intelligent investor, because as I did it and as I got good at it, I was like, how come nobody's talking about this in a formal way? So you're absolutely right, Javier. Like I sought to create a structure and a framework so people could, begin to tap some of this magic stuff.
And it's as you say, it's a manual for the right brain, as opposed to everyone focuses on the left brain. But again, the great ones don't. People who become stockbrokers at 23 and retire at 63 as stockbrokers, what you became the head of a fund and you made a tremendous amount of money and you were able to retire at 35. How did you get on that fast track path? Do you attribute it to your right brain mainly?
Oh
Or
yeah, 100%, 100%. And I'll give a little bit more detail there. In the investment business, and it's even more so true now than it was 20 years ago. It's been 19 years since, I was working as a professional investor. Um, the left brain and analysis and familiarity with the jargon of the business, which is a tall obstacle to overcome, that's table stakes. You have to have that. There's nobody who is ill-informed or dumb in the investment business. And for people who are looking to investing to be the difference maker to achieving dreams, which I know is the brand of Javier Novoa the second, right, on your channel, is essentially how do we make difference in our lives so that we can take control and have greater optionality, right? And making choices that make our lives, I don't want to put words in your mouth, more fulfilling, beautiful,
absolutely.
interesting, fun. Um, it's the right brain, right? The left brain, all the people in the investment business have that. You're not going to outcompete them in that. And so it's not finding the extra bit of data. That data is, I guarantee you, well discounted, well assessed, well traded upon. If it's been put into a quantity, it's already over. What's different is knowing which numbers when matter. And that's a totally different skill. And knowing and trusting things that haven't been put into or reduced to number and knowing their importance is that's where the alpha is, the additional return that's available to people. Because it's not numeric, because it's not quantifiable, it also means that computers are not going to be pricing it either. It's 100% my right brain that led to the outperformance and, granted me the privilege of being able to retire at a young age.
If you're just trying to compete on left brain, well, there are a lot smarter people than me out there doing this. In fact, just the day before yesterday, I had an interview with Derek Sivers, who's a famous author, and he was talking about the fact that he doesn't even try to predict the markets. He puts his money in ETFs that basically match the market because he said there are just too smart people out there, and I'm not that smart, so I can't do this. So if you want alpha, like you said, the only option is to go extra rational or super rational.
Yeah, and in the book, and for the folks watching the podcast, these are all wisdom functions. And there's in Western culture, there's almost no appreciation for wisdom as a concept. And I know this because after I published The Intuitive Investor, I was on a book tour and periodically, and especially right after the book was published, did workshops for people, got interviewed. And I would ask audiences, to come up with a definition of intelligence. And generally speaking, you could crowdsource an amazing definition of intelligence. And then you would ask people for a definition of wisdom, and it was almost impossible to crowdsource that definition. And most people think of wisdom as a subset of intelligence, and to me, it's just not. Wisdom is essentially the degree to which your consciousness is in accord with reality. And I think that's like the key definition in The Intuitive Investor, because if you can wrap your mind around that, it's like, anything that helps me harmonize with or understand or get in tune with reality and what's really unfolding, that's where the insight is. And it's possible that that's been numerically quantified by somebody, but more often than not, that material is not available. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of and I saw the Jim Rogers interview, which you sent to me, and Jim
Mhm.
also is a spiritual guy, even though you didn't
Yes.
necessarily hit on those topics. And I know that from Kim. I know that from others who know Jim as well and know some of his practices and what have you. But in any case, like understanding management and can I trust this person is absolutely a wisdom function. And if you're investing in a business, it's these managers, these CEOs, these CFOs, these COOs, whatever their C-suite role, they're the ones who are fighting the real fight. You have to find those people that you trust to invest in, and that trusting bit is absolutely all a wisdom function. It's not an intelligence function. You can't reduce somebody's trustworthiness intellectually. You have to have a profound feel of, okay, this person's really working hard for me and for the benefit of me. And by the way, there's an investment secret. Find those people whom you trust and allocate capital to them. And by the way, that's exactly what Buffett says. Buffett basically says, most of my job is finding people that I trust to treat the capital as precious and invest the capital on my behalf. And it's really easy once you identify those people. Anyway, I digress. Wisdom is the counter lever to intelligence, and it's like the key theme of the book, and that's where all of the magic I think comes from in the investment process.
And that's why, like, for example, Jim Rogers and yourself in that you've written in your book, you would actually go and see these people, visit these managers to actually see what their wavelength is.
Yeah, yeah, all of it's evidence, right? So when I was in graduate business school, I remember taking an accounting class with a guy named John Tracy, whose book, by the way, I highly recommend. I know you asked Jim Rogers, like, what book on accounting
Mhm.
would you recommend? And in the back of the Intuitive Investor, there's like a recommended readings list. He wrote a
Wringing the
book.
information from the numbers, right?
That's the second book. The
So,
first, well, I think that's the subtitle. It's How to Read a
so
Financial Report.
how to read?
It is
That's
a
right.
brilliant book, and I was fortunate enough to have him as a professor, and I probably owe him a lot of money. His son now writes all the updated editions of it. But in any case, in that class, he asked the MBA class at the University of Colorado, go Buffs. He asked them, what's a good definition for what it means to be a manager? What's the job of a CEO? And again, he tried to crowdsource this whole thing. And he said, look, I can reduce it to two words. And everybody's like, really? Leans in, like, how can you reduce like the job of CEO to 2 words? And he said, manage everything. And the corollary to that, though, is everything is evidence of management. And so if you go visit a company, just going to their offices, here's an example. I visit Crown Castle, who's there in Texas, or used to be there in Texas. And they're a company that had never earned a single dollar of profit. And they own cell towers, and they're now the world's largest cell phone tower owner. And I visited them, and they had the most posh offices almost that I've ever seen. I'm like, how is this possible? And it made me really uneasy about them because I'm like, look at what they've spent on these offices, and they've never generated a dollar of profits for their shareholders. And I wouldn't have known that that's a part of the culture of Crown Castle if all I did was watch the interviews on CNBC or listen to the quarterly earnings calls. But by visiting their offices and seeing their offices in person, it's like, okay, now I understand how they consider capital, and they didn't consider it as precious. They didn't consider it as something to be conserved and to earn a return on. It was a little bit profligate, and it made me very uneasy.
Are you familiar with the work of Chris Camillo?
A little bit, but remind me. He's somebody on my journey that I've encountered along the way.
He is a social arb. Basically, he goes on TikTok, he goes on Twitter, and he finds trends. And he doesn't even look at the numbers of the company. What he'll do is he'll like the Elf Cosmetics when it exploded. He went to Target and basically just watched whether people are buying Elf Cosmetics. And I just learned about him probably this year, and I said, this reminds me a lot of Jason and his book, because what you say in your book is that when someone asks you, when do you work? You said, I'm always working. Your eyes are always open. And this goes into the first point of infinity, the first
Yeah.
principle of your book, that basically we're always working, and we just have to basically see what's in the scope of our attention and then harmonize with the aspects of that, correct?
You nailed it. And by the way, that's probably the best summation of like those two key principles in the book. And the like one of the questions, and going to front run maybe one of your questions, why did I retire? One of the reasons I retired was a very complex, difficult decision. One of the reasons was I got exhausted by that mindset of always working. And everything that I encountered in a daily basis was an investment opportunity. I couldn't, for example, go to the movies and not go, oh, the new DLP technology from Texas Instruments is a much better viewing experience as you're sitting there watching a movie at the local theater. Or like you'd go to dinner and I would look at the waiter's shoes and I'd be like, oh, the waiter, like in this affluent city, his shoes are really upscale. So this must be like an affluent city. Like your primary mindset was investment, 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 investment. And by the way, when I would recruit people for the job, that was what I was looking for, is that immersion. Essentially, like fish don't know they're in water, right? Human beings don't think about the air. I was interested in the people who were totally immersed in the waters of investing. And I come back to that because that's what allows you to connect the dots. And so relative to Camillo, that's exactly what is important. Like I remember going to in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I spent my career. And like one of the things that was happening is that the Hispanic culture in the United States was starting to gain primacy. Like you'd see Hispanic actors in movies, and they weren't always gangsters and thugs any longer, right? They now have leading roles and interests. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. There's a cultural shift taking place. And I remember going to the local grocery store and like, instead of there being, Doritos, now they're like 10 brands of
Tortillas.
tortilla chip. And that's one of the examples I give in the book. I'm like, oh, the Hispanic culture is now here and marketers have noticed it. And so I need to start thinking about that demographic in a profound way. That's information that is accessible to every investor if they're paying attention and they're immersed like that. There's information everywhere. So I haven't read Samillo's book or Camillo. I forgot how you say it.
I think it's Camillo. I'm not sure if he's Hispanic or Italian. I know
Yeah.
he lives in Dallas. I just saw an interview with him. And he says he doesn't even look at numbers of companies. He just looks at these trends. And I said, you know what? This reminds me a lot of Jason. He probably wouldn't say it, but this is an intuitive way of investing.
Oh, it's a totally intuitive way. And a point
Mhm.
on that, material not in Intuitive Investor, because it's an old book by now. I worked from 2018 through 2021 as a consultant, and I would embed with investment teams to help them improve their process and their execution. so they could earn better results for the benefit of their shareholders. And inevitably, one of the exercises in embedding with the teams, and these are, mind you, for your audience, these are the folks who make a tremendous amount of money to allocate capital on your behalf, and all of them, without, but I can't think of many exceptions, do valuation work. They value businesses. And inevitably, I would say, have you ever looked at the data on the success of your valuation models? And they'd be like, no. So that was always like one of the parts of an engagement is let's actually pull all the data of your valuation models. Do you have a record of your valuation models? Of course we do. It's part of our due diligence. Great. Let's look at the record and performance of this. Those pros, the people who do this for a living, some of the world's best business evaluators, they always miss the mark. It's never what they say it's going to be. But then the question I would ask them is, so why do you engage in this activity if it's not successful? And they go, because they couldn't hear when they looked at the quantities present, and the quantities showed that valuation was a useless activity from the standpoint and the denominator of does it accurately predict stock prices? And when you would show them that it didn't work, that they got very defensive. And I said, no, I'm not saying it's not a worthwhile activity, but I want you to understand why it's worthwhile. And it ties into principle one infinity, into Camillo's work. And the answer is, why do you do this? It becomes a framework and an arena for valuable discussions about understanding the business. Because as you have a framework with valuation, you have to think about revenues. You have to think about the expenses and the supplier relationships. You have to think about how they compensate employees. You have to think about how shareholders add or detract value from the business. You have to think about how they finance themselves. It's a valuable activity because indirectly, it has a great framework for evaluating all of the aspects of the business, putting them in your consciousness, and having that consciousness play, game, whatever you want to call it, of do I get it? Do I understand this business? Am I harmonizing with its competitive position, its management's ability to invest capital on my behalf well? That activity is a crucible for all of that good thinking, but the actual activity of valuing the business is, in my estimation, kind of useless. But anyway, that's like principle one infinity. So of course Camillo can just look at the social aspects of the business because the valuation activity is not important. It's only important if it helps you understand the business better. And that's it. In an understanding of business, I would start by all of the atmospherics around the company, and I'd be aware this company does this activity. Over here, there's a trend. Who can address this trend well? This company over here. It's all part of the nexus, the infinity, the universe of possibilities, and connecting the dots. The valuation came at the end, and it was a crucible for me to organize my thoughts and be like, okay, now what could go wrong here? I don't like that they have so much debt on their balance sheet. I probably should ask investor relations about, hey, do they have an intention of, taking some of the earnings of this business and paying down the debt? Like the valuation was for me also a crucible for understanding and organizing my thoughts. And in that way, valuation of a business is a very valuable framework. But again, note, and you'll love this, I'm sure, it's not a left brain activity that I'm actually complementing. It may look like a left brain activity, but to the uninitiated, but the real process that's going on there is it's a framework for your intuition to go, that I like, this I've got questions about.
Talk about emotions and feelings. And on my channel, I differentiate between emotions and feelings. And I say that emotion is a thought plus a physical feeling. Give the example of someone having fear, and that is basically a signal for you to stop. Like, let's say you have fear, but when you think about a company, you don't really know why, but it's a signal to stop. But anxiety is an emotion that perhaps came from some of your past conditioning, and then observe that and sort of let that dissolve. What's the difference between emotions and feelings? How do we know the difference between them?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, one of the difficulties of the intuitive investor is most people haven't stopped to consider some of these like nuances of consciousness. And this is one of the primary ones in the book. So a feeling is prime. A feeling is uncorrupted by your prejudices or your preferences for life. And one of the things I look at with dismay of parenting, for example, is that parents are obsessed with asking their child what they want, and from a very young age. And what they're creating is a default consciousness or default way of viewing the world of do I like or do I not like this? And it's those prejudices and preferences for what do I like to eat for dinner? What do I like to drink? What experiences do I like or not like that become emotions, right? Because as soon as those preferences are violated, that's where there's antagonism with what is a part of the overall experience of living. There's like, isn't it like I'm mostly a vegetarian, but last night I ate beef. Why? Because I was in the mood for beef, right? So I didn't have an absolute admonition against meat. I was in the mood for it. That was my feeling. I honored it. I didn't have a preference for I only ever eat vegetables or, non-animal based products. Anyway, so a feeling is a signal delivered by the universe to you. The tendency of people is to immediately try and add words or numbers, quantities or qualities to that so they can make sense of it. And the brilliance of number and words is it provides a way of you sharing that and being logical about that. Note the word logic. So it's really good for the left brain. But part of how you become more intuitive is to have those experiences of the world without naming it, without quantifying it, and that's the feeling, and the feelings are everywhere, and we've all had them, right? So we've all had the experience, I think, of you're walking down an urban street and that person over there creeps me out for whatever reason. I don't even have to name it. I'm just like, okay, I'm going to cross the street now. I don't want any part of whatever this madness is over here. And that's like a feeling. That's also the distinction between a fear and an anxiety. The fear is I just directly act, right? That's a pure, clear signal. The anxiety comes from, oh, the last time I encountered a person like this, this experience happened to me, and oh my God, and you start ruminating about it. If you're thinking in terms of words about something that's just occurred to you, you're in the realm of emotions. And so part of the intuitive investor is giving people the framework to dial back the quantification, the prejudices and the preferences, the automatic sorting of reality that we all do on a daily basis and get back to the, hey, can I be quiet and be with this company I'm about to invest with? And how do I feel about this whole thing? And it's very tricky. It's very tricky. But to summarize this whole thing, a feeling is the pure, clear signal from the universe about something. The emotion comes as soon as I attach my preference or prejudice onto that pure, clear feeling. And then all of a sudden, I'm in an intellectual realm. And all I have to pull on, if I can't acknowledge the feeling, is all that came before. So now I'm hoping that the past does repeat itself, and we all know the investment, get out of jail free card. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. And
Exactly.
now I'm in the realm of the intellect. I'm hoping probabilistically, mathematically, that all of the things that I have prejudices and preferences around of this is the type of company I invest in, that they repeat themselves going forward. Now I've just missed some form of opportunity because I've smeared the feeling into non-existence. It's gone. And so it's really tough to get back to the feeling, but you nailed it, Javier. That's the core concept of the whole book is how do we tune into these feelings? How do we reestablish our consciousness and carve out that space to have that pure experience of what's really happening here? It's really hard. It really is hard.
It's sort of like you have to practice it. There's no way that you or I could tell somebody here's the manual for it. You
That's
have to
right.
practice it.
Yeah, that's the only way to unwind that. And like when I would have taught meditation, one of the first things is to get people to develop a witness consciousness, which is, and one of the beautiful things about human consciousness is we do have metacognition. And we've had all of us, the experience of watching ourselves think. What is that thing? How is it we're able to bifurcate our consciousness? And over here, we can watch our mind like go crazy. And there's a part of us going, what are you doing? Why, like, it could be an argument with a spouse. I love this person. Why am I being such a jerk, right? Like, all of a sudden, there's a separation of like and a non-attachment to the experience. And all of a sudden, now I'm in the feeling state, not the emotional state where my spouse has irritated me. And it's like, I need to apologize, right? Like, and I'm able to separate. Anyway, the first thing that is important in terms of a practice, to your point, is to develop and carve out the ability to separate at will, if ideally, the ability to, from this experience, to go, can I witness my own mind thinking? Can I witness where these prejudices and preferences are coming from? I'll give you an example for the benefit of the readers. I had an intern one summer when I was a fund manager who has gone on to be a brilliant real estate investor, and I can't remember if this is in the intuitive investor or not. And I noticed that his preferences, the stock recommendations he made frequently had like a kind of a characteristic about them that they were aggressive, right? Like they had kind of a sex appeal and a, kind of like uh, a classic kind of masculine, like, like football player on steroids, kind of like quality to them. And I'm like, hey, yo, these investments all kind of have like this similar quality to them. And I noticed this is a prejudice and a preference of yours. Where did it come from? And he like intellectualized this and he thought about it. And I encouraged him. And one of the reasons I chose him as an intern is I thought he had the capability of doing this separation of consciousness to get metacognition going. By the way, metacognition, an actual scientific term. He had
Absolutely.
metacognition, and I used to interview for metacognition. And over the course of a couple months, he came in one Monday morning and he goes, "My dad." I'm like, "What about your dad?" He said, "My dad is the source of that attitude." And I guess he had this intern had an older brother who was more athletic and always got the attention of his dad. And he's like, I remember one time I went skiing with my dad and my brother, and I was always jealous of my brother and his relationship with my dad because my dad liked him way better. And I was at the top of a hill as a skier, and I was like, I'd rather die than not beat my brother down to the bottom of the hill. And he beat his brother down. He's like, I was in the seat of my pants. I almost died. I thought I was going to die. I was at the bridge. And I got to the bottom. My dad goes, "That's it. That's what I want from you." And he's like, that's where that attitude came from. So note the prejudices and preferences. It was created because of a totally unrelated thing to his investment process. It's because he liked those feelings, because when he had that feeling, he felt appreciated and loved in that moment. So this drove his stock decisions. And my response to the intern was, your dad doesn't work for us. Unsympathetically. But essentially, by him developing a witness consciousness, he's like, where does this come from? Why do I keep repeating this thing over and over again? He developed a prejudice and preference when I'm being stimulated in this way. It triggers in me feelings of wholeness, love, whatever. So I make recommendations of stocks. That's what it takes really and that's a very difficult thing that I just described. But if you practice it, you'll get better and better and better and be able to peel off some of this crap that we've got that drives these decisions and leads to uninformed bad decisions. And it's, yeah, as to your point, Javier, it's a part of what I try and teach in the book.
You believe in the law of attraction and manifestation?
I do. In the Intuitive Investor, in the latter half of the book, I have a framework for that, which
You do.
is stolen from Buddhism. And then, and just for the benefit of the watchers of the podcast, it's inspiration, imagination, thought, word, deed. And when those five things are present in roughly equal parts, magic begins to happen in your life. Subsequent to writing The Intuitive Investor, I've also served as an executive coach for people, especially when I was advising investment teams on how to improve process and execution. And this was one of my frameworks for understanding their journeys as investment professionals was I would be listening to their stories and their narratives and be like, hey, why did you choose to work with me? What's going on in your life? And, what are your prejudices and preferences for how your life turns out? And inevitably, one of those five things was missing. Let me go through them and talk about why they're important to have in rough equivalency or harmony with one another.
Please do.
Inspiration is exactly what we've been talking about so far, Javier, which is that there's a feeling in the universe, and I have experienced it, and that frequently, when you have that huzzah, aha moment, is accompanied by feelings of joy and like a pleasure that waves of pleasure go through your body. Like, wow, that's really cool. That's an inspiration. Based on inspiration alone, you're not going to manifest something. You then have to take that inspiration and be like, okay, what do I do with this? As soon as you're in the what do I do with this, there's a bridge between inspiration, imagination, thought. Thought is the intellectualization of stuff. It's structuring. It's taking knowledge and other things I've read, and the imagination bit is balancing that thought and the frameworks and all the mental models I may have learned over the years. And I took an MBA course or a psychology course. That's the thought stuff. The inspiration stuff is the right brain wisdom part. The imagination is, what do I do with this? What are possible ways of monetizing this? It could be an investment, it could be starting a business, it could be who knows what it is. Thought is the thinking about it. The word is the commitment. I give my word, I commit to doing this thing, and then I actually have to do the deed. Usually, if you're not manifesting, the things aren't happening for you, one of those is completely absent. And in a lot of the new age spiritual community, it's the deed. They think it's enough to just like have the mindset, the inspiration, the imagination, the thoughts about it, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I'm really committed to becoming a billionaire," but there's no deeds undertaken on behalf of that. And so they just sit there hoping that by thinking good thoughts, all of a sudden magic happens. In my experience, it doesn't happen that way. You have to give something to get something, and that's karma. And I think karma is definitely one of the laws of the universe. Likewise, there are a lot of people in the investment business, my realm, who are obsessed with thoughts, have lots of commitments, do lots of activity. They may be paid professional investors. And what's missing is any creativity, the imagination phase of what they're doing, and almost always no inspiration, right? They're just rinse, repeat the same mental models over and over again, looking at the same data sources as the other 2 million people globally engaged in this activity, hoping that I'm going to get something out of it that nobody else does. And they don't. They don't have a variegated or differentiated investment process, so there's no imagination. And there sure as heck is usually not an inspiration of, oh, I don't know why, but I got to sell this business. And so usually manifestation happens when all five of those things are equivalent. And if they're not equivalent and stuff's not happening, it provides a framework for going, hey, what am I needing to do in order to make this thing happen for myself?
So doesn't deed become smaller as a proportion to all of it? Say inspiration grows, doesn't deed become smaller? Because I've heard you in some interviews say that you had whittled down working hours a day to working like 1 hour a week. So there has to be something said for minimizing action or making that using the Pareto principle, even without getting spiritual, we can make action have more impact. How does that fit in with this framework?
Yeah, I think that's true, right? But it's not really that you dial back the deed. It's like if those five things are equivalent, then all of a sudden the deed becomes just you recognize and you have awareness of, hey, a lot of what I do is just busy work, right? It's just like
Mm-hmm.
I'm paid, and this was a very difficult thing as an investor. The very beginning of my career, I was working like 100 to 105 hours a week. And for your
Yes.
audience, if you work out the math there, the 168 hours in the week to work 105 hours plus sleep, you get like 18 minutes a day to yourself. Like it's not a lot. And most of what I was engaged in was thought, commitment, and deed. And there was almost no imagination, almost no inspiration. But as the inspiration part became easier, and I would spend a lot of my free time not working, doing things that rejuvenated me and engaged
Mm-hmm.
in that inspired, imaginative state. There's no reason to do the busy work anymore. So it's not really that you work less. It's just that in the hours of the day, it makes up a smaller part of the pie. And so what I'm trying to communicate is, say you choose to work 80 hours a week, if all 80 is on the deed part and I just work and grind it out, then you're missing the other four steps. What I'm saying is you want those roughly equivalent. And that people in your audience will then go, oh, Jason just said, spend 16 hours a day, 5 days a week, 16 hours, 1 day a week on deed, 60 hours a week on commitment. It's like, no, 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 I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when this magic happens, I think upon reflection, on average, you'll find that these things are equivalent. And so it's not really that you have to dial back the work. It's just that you recognize, oh, a lot of what I do is non-productive. I should spend more time meditating than actually, embedded with my nose in a spreadsheet or a trading algorithm on a trading site. So that's what I'm trying to communicate. Yes, you're correct. The deed part, the work part dials back, but it's replaced by more time meditating, more time having fun. And that's, one of the central themes of your channel is that fun stuff actually is investing in a particular way, because if
Absolutely.
you're rejuvenating and you're paying attention to the world and you're enjoying the world, as you become more joyful and you start to acknowledge these aspects of life, all of a sudden the deed part gets easier in some ways.
Harmonizing. I was hoping you could explain it to us a little more because in your book, you give a process. You get into a meditative state and you tell yourself harmonize with the stock market.
Yeah.
How's that actually done? Is that just something that you just have to sit down and do and then see what happens, or is there more framework you can give us about how to do that?
Yeah. So This is one of the reasons why for years now I've worked on a second edition of the Intuitive Investors to help some of
Can't
these
wait to read it.
concepts. Yeah. Yeah, it's all a time thing for me, right? And a commitment thing. Like every time I try to write what I'm inspired to write. And when I wrote the book, one of the things that I had low knowledge of, and maybe it's because I was in Santa Fe, which is generally speaking kind of a spiritual place, and a lot of the people I was surrounded with do meditate and they do engage in spiritual practice. That's a really hard thing to do, what you just asked me to explain. I will explain it, but just know for your audience, it takes work, it takes practice. And to harmonize with something, the key thing is to strip away the elements of ego. Ego is best defined, and we've already been talking about it here, stripping away the prejudices and preferences of your life, right? The emotions of your life. Emotions and ego are very similar things to one another. Ego is like the parts of your identity that you clutch onto. It's a preference for how to be and how I tilt into the world. Like, for example, after I retired, I moved to Ohio to study martial arts. I had a friend, meditator, new agey lady, whatever. Central to her identity was I'm a caring, loving person. And essentially, her life history was one of being a doormat and taking advantage of people. And I could not convince her, no matter what, that being a friendly, compassionate, giving person in an asymmetrical way, 100% of my life is giving to others, and that was core to her identity. She could not believe me that that was ego and driven by ego. And it was driven by ego because she so was in love with that identity for herself that she couldn't ever tell somebody no. There was an overpreponderance of yes energy to anything that was requested of her. And so what that meant was she couldn't allow her identity to conform with, harmonize with other ways of being. And this is what it takes to harmonize with something. So if you can, through meditative practice and recognizing where your prejudices and preferences come from, including identity, you can get to states of consciousness free from identity. And then it's really simple to place into your mind's eye Alcoa, Boeing, Corning, right? I'm going ABC in terms of stock tickers, right? And be like, okay, what's the general feeling of being Corning, Dow Corning? What is the general feeling of being Apple? What is the general feeling of being the U.S. stock market right now? And you get a sense, you'll feel yourself start to become that thing. And there are times in my career, I'm like, oh my God, as I tune into the feeling of the market, I feel nauseous. I feel like I'm about to throw up, and my body is actually like starting to get really agitated. So that's a feeling. Now I can engage my intellect. I now have to name that, given all my experiences. What is that I'm feeling? And now I can switch to left brain mode and I'd be like, huh, you know what that feels like? It feels like a tremendous amount of anxiety about the current state of the world. Likely there's going to be a stock market hiccup. And I give an experience in the book of in 2009, March 9th, 2009, which was the market low in the heart of the great financial crisis. I had been tuning into the market every day for months, and it felt just as I just described. It was nausea. It was just like, oh my God, it's horrible. Oh my God, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Like tremendous anxious experience. March 9th, I tuned in and I was like, and I don't know if people have ever had the experience of having the flu and they've, vomited or whatever. There's that sense of sickness and illness, but relief of, oh, whatever that is gone.
Relief.
And that's what I experienced on March 9th, 2009. And then I was like, do I trust this? Because I had felt it before in the fall of 2008, had reinvested after having been in cash, and then the market re-engaged in this anxious pattern. So I waited till March 10th, then March 11th. It still felt the same. It's like people were like, okay, the people who were participating in the market had basically expressed that anxiety and nausea that everybody who had wanted to sell had sold. And I was like, now's the time to invest. And that's only possible if you allow yourself and your identity to be like the thing you're tuning into. But you can tune into almost anything. Here's practice for the audience. And this is how I trained myself.
Please do.
Driving, I'm sitting behind another car in front of me. Where's this car going? Is this person at the next intersection going to go straight, left, or right? There are only three choices. And so because there are only three choices, you harmonize with the driver in front of you. And be like, I have a sense of they're going to go left in their consciousness. They formed in their mind's eye, oh, I got to get ready for this left-hand turn. I got to, this left-hand turn lane's difficult. I got to cross 3 lanes of traffic. You can start to feel that in them. And that's great practice before you put money behind it to getting better. And you can get better. The other thing you could do is at the grocery store, same thing. You're falling behind somebody at Whole Foods or, Publix here in Florida, and you're like, where's this person going to turn? Are they going to go down the juice aisle? They're going to go to the ice cream aisle? Where they're going to do? And that's a great way of training this, and you start to get the feeling. Now, what's tricky, it's tougher in the grocery store because you can read body language. Somebody might start to move their cart over there. It's easier driving because driving is going straight. The car is basically going straight. And my point is that you can read body language cues, and you don't want to do that because that's inference. That's inferring from body language. You don't want to infer from body language. You want to actually know, oh, they're going to turn left, go straight, or go right. I still do that exercise. My mom lives about 10 minutes from me, and every time I do that
Well,
drive, I'm like, and it's a single lane road, I'm like, where's this person going to turn off? And I'd say I'm right about 65% of the time, 70% of the time. And so after years of practice, anyway, it takes time, but that's what I meant by harmonizing is once you're non-egoically grounded, you can harmonize with almost anything.
when you had a success basically getting some information out of that Devon executive about what they were going to do by asking him what languages he was learning.
Yeah.
But at the end of that, you said, I also spent almost the entire afternoon in a meditative state because I realized the answer to this one question was more valuable than any other I could possibly uncover. So you'd been preparing for that by being in a meditative state. How does one spend the entire afternoon in a meditative state? Was it just in a state of complete presence, sort of like Eckhart Tolle?
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what it's born of a lot of practice, right? So a lot of meditative practice. And by the way, for your audience, a lot of people in the audience are going, hey, I don't want to meditate. Meditation is a natural state of human consciousness. We're all meditators. Meditation as a practice is different than meditation as a state of awareness. We all have
Exactly.
meditative consciousness. We would be dead if we didn't. We would be robots. That's, by the way, the difference between us and AI. I don't think AI will ever gain consciousness because it's mechanical. It's the result
You
of
just
analytical.
harmonized with me, man, because that was exactly the question I was going to ask. How did you know that?
Yeah.
You knew that,
Well,
right?
who knows? But
You-
that's why, consciousness is the ground of reality, not matter.
it
And
is.
that's one of the central themes of the book. And that's been proven to me over and over again that we create the matter. Consciousness is what's prime. And that's why I don't think AI will ever gain consciousness. That doesn't mean it won't rhyme with consciousness. And for analytical minds that try and evaluate whether AI has gained consciousness, it'll look like and it'll check all the boxes, but it won't be capable of the inspiration state of awareness. That's the big difference.
And it will never be teleological, in my opinion,
You
which
nailed
many
it.
people think that AI is going to take over. That would assume that AI has some kind of teleology and is a consumer.
Yeah.
But you are the CEO of deception and truth analysis data. You work not because you have to, you just work for the love of it.
For the love
You
of it and
wouldn't
for
have to
the
work
love
for
of
it.
my wife, right?
Oh,
Like our lives are better because of me working, right? And so
certainly.
it affords us a lifestyle that allows us to have that sense of freedom that I appreciate about your channel, right? I love that you use the word freedom because like it or not, more money equals more freedom, more optionality, more choices. And I just, that's one of my principal things that I vibrate with and central to my identity is that sense of freedom. And by the way, for completeness, in terms of identity, while I love that aspect of myself, there are times when I make sacrifices and dial back my freedom as a form of, gaining greater freedom later, which is that investment consciousness. Anyway, you have to it's not that identity is bad, going back to our earlier conversation. It's just that you have to choose what you're engaging in. It can't be on autopilot. That's like what I'm talking about. But anyway, yes, I am the CEO of Deception and Truth Analysis because, and I'm going to tie this back into your interview with Jim Rogers. At one point, you asked Jim Rogers a question. I can't remember quite what it was, but you're basically saying, hey, what's the common thread through your investment career? And he really struggled to answer that, which was one of the reasons I wrote The Intuitive Investor. And by the way, Jim's a way better investor than me. But I bothered to slow down, to try and write a book that could tie stuff together for people so that other people could replicate the results that I got. And, I'd be honored if I could generate the results that Jim got.
You're self-conscious in it.
Yeah, I'm self-conscious in it. And the common thread, and this is the nature of investing as an activity, and it also ties into deception and truth analysis, where we measure in a systematic scientific way the behaviors of people, either through the written word or the spoken word, based on science. And the common thread to Jim's success and all investors' success is in the replicability of habit on the part of people. Habits are really hard to change. Once they're enshrined, they tend to repeat themselves over and over again. And the story of Jim's success is he's developed tools and an intuition for reading the habits of investors, of governments, of other people, and habits you can absolutely bank on. If you can identify those habits and understand how different habits collide to create outcome, well, then you start to have insight. So for our company, Deception Truth Analysis, we measure deceptive behavior and truthful behavior, and we've been shocked to find a very simple decision rule. Identify the 40% of the S&P 500's companies that are most truthful, invest in those, quarterly rebalance. You can significantly outperform the S&P 500. Not only that, but markets seem to price what we're measuring very slowly. It takes up to a year for this signal that we're measuring to become fully priced. How's that possible? Our theory, our hypothesis, and ties, I think, all this stuff together is most people, when they're investing, look at the numbers, but the numbers are outcomes of the business and its operations. Those numbers are driven by choices made, driven by management, driven by their behaviors. And if you can go further up the food chain through intuition, through the looking at the makeup aisle at Target, right? If you can get a sense of the behaviors that are present, the outcomes become a fait accompli, right? It becomes the
Exactly,
natural
precisely.
outcome because most people are on autopilot. And you look at the great successful companies, it's because they create habits of belief in their customers. Like look at Apple, and it's a total cult. The secret of Apple, to
Exactly.
me, is that they've convinced, like Levi's a generation before, that the world's largest company or one of the world's largest companies is somehow an outsider brand that's about the individual. It's like it couldn't be more opposite that. But they've created that habit in their consumer of looking to Apple for that part of themselves that they honor as an individual. My brand is Apple. Brilliant. And that's, I would argue, the success of Apple is they've created that habit. Anyway, all of this, Jim's success, investor success, is they have an appreciation for what are the habits of culture, of governments, of individual businesses that I can rely upon because habits don't change frequently. So anyway, I wanted to share that because that's what our company does.
It sort of ties in with another one of my favorite parts of your book where you talk about one of the secrets of your success was that you would identify another unit of value separate from money, correct? Like, for
Yep.
example, in oil production companies, you could count barrels of oil as opposed to income. Could you dilate on that just a little bit more and also how that ties in with your data? Because you're not looking necessarily at the numbers, you're looking at other aspects that are just as oftentimes just as quantifiable, but for some reason other people don't look at them.
Yeah. That and this still features large in the way it's one of my preferred mental models. Is I ask my team at Deception Truth Analysis frequently. I'm like, what's your denominator? What's driving the decision? What's the mental model you're using? Because when you choose the denominator, it's going to dictate how you see the world. So, for example, if what you're looking at in a business is only earnings, because all that matters is earnings, or all that matters is cash flow, that creates a particular lens, and you're only going to see the company through that lens. And it's not that that's dangerous. Again, if that proves beneficial more often than not, it's a good habit for you to be in. But it's also useful to say, hey, what's the fundamental unit that I need to understand, the primary denominator of this business I need to understand in order to make money in this company? And so the one that I like is that in the airline business, they look at something which is called revenues per passenger mile, right? And that's what they manage, because that's if they manage that well, they're going to do okay as a business. In the oil business, barrels of oil equivalent is what they manage. And they're not managing revenues or profits, they're managing barrels of oil and the economic value net of barrels per oil. And so you can ask yourself those kinds of questions frequently. That when I first became a research analyst at a mutual fund, I had a goal of I wanted to be promoted to portfolio manager before I had handed out all my business cards. And I knew I would have counted myself successful if the 800 business cards I still had a big box full of them, because I noticed I handed out a lot of these. I'm like, I don't want to wait till all of these are handed out, I want this to be not a part of my life. And that was my denominator. And it drove other aspects of my life. And I was like, and I kept coming back to it. I was like, oh, this month I handed out 40 of these, and it kept like chugging through that. Here's one. Headcount. Headcount in a business is one of my favorite denominators. If you have two companies that, for all intents and purposes, look equivalent, look at the most annual reports of companies, they publish the headcount number. I would look at the revenues per headcount, costs per headcount, profits per headcount. The one that has lower headcount, prefer. And that's a different way of denominating the business is, what's the profitability per employee? Because that tells you really how productive the business is. And that was one of my favorite ones. So that's an example of changing the common denominator of which you evaluated business and business potential.
In deception and truth analysis, you use AI, correct? To
A little
study
bit,
a
a
little
little
bit,
bit.
to study the
Yeah, yeah.
structure of writings of companies, see whether you can find indicators
Well,
of
sort of. I'll
untruthfulness.
explain. We use AI, but only tangentially. So one of my fetishes that I developed in 2011, and to me is honoring something that was unfinished business when I retired from investment management, was how do we scientifically, systematically measure the trustworthiness of management? And management trustworthiness, especially if you're more value oriented rather than quantitative investor, is a big deal. And when I retired, I didn't have a quantitative way of doing that. I only relied on intuition. By the way, I think I was pretty good at that.
Mhm.
But I always felt like there's got to be more that we can do. In 2011, I exited retirement. I worked at CFA Institute that awards the CFA charter, which some of the viewership of your channel may know what that is. It's like the equivalent of the bar exam, or like being a barrister for finance. And I was their global director of content. And I conducted, in conjunction with criminal justice professionals, history's first research into the convergence of finance, investing, and deception science. And it's a space that
Wow.
nobody had ever researched before. And so our company is based on using natural language processing to look for more than 30 behavioral differences between deceivers and truth tellers in the written word or transcripts of the spoken word. We do use AI, but not for that core algorithm. That core algorithm is very uh, what's the right word? Science driven, cause and effect driven, as it solves a problem. But it works when we evaluate narrative. So we use a little bit of AI to identify in a document, is there a title page, table of contents, an income statement, which is numbers. We use AI to identify non-narrative content to excise, but the core algorithm itself is based on deception science. So that's clarification.
And yeah, that is seems like very fun work for you.
Well, it isn't, right? Like one of the things that we've learned is that a lot of the asset management business is not prepared to question its assumptions. And it's very rare that we thought that, let me rewind. We thought when we launched this business 3 years ago, we'd be seen as the second coming. Like, oh my God, this is a last mile problem in the investment business. Thank you for, providing us with a scientific, systematic way of evaluating management. And by the way, independently, we've been evaluated to be predictive of future stock prices around 70% of the time. It's like 70.12%. Our assessments are accurate, which is huge. It's huge. Like you can make a lot of money based on it, but we're not greeted with open arms.
Wow.
Instead, people, like we were talking to a young man about a month ago, and we've been critical of Apple and its gross margin assumptions for about a year now, saying Apple's being deceptive about its gross margin assumptions. Why? And we were public about it. And so we tout this as a success of our software in helping Apple shareholders avoid a gross margin compression. And by the way, Apple has 6 months after we called it, guided down on gross margins. And we shared this story with a young analyst at a mutual fund. And he said, I watched Tim Cook on CNBC and he seems like he's a good guy. And so we've run headlong into people's belief that, oh, I already do this well. If I wasn't, and he said to us, if I didn't evaluate management well, I wouldn't be a very good investor. Never mind the fact that his firm chronically underperforms his benchmark.
It's
So,
fear of being replaced. And I'd hate to sound like a broken record. I bring Chris Camilo back into this again. I don't know if you're familiar. He started a company called Ticker Tags, and it was basically some kind of for a person who's not extremely a tech expert. I can explain it as it's sort of a way to search keywords to see trends. And he tried to market it to hedge funds in Wall Street, and no one wanted anything to do with it. I think
yeah.
that more than anything, it's a fear of being replaced, correct? Or it's sort of like an ego thing.
I don't know if I could name it and get to the root cause of this, we would be more successful as a company. We're thinking of launching a hedge fund because we know what we do works and it works profoundly well to be able to identify the habits of behavior, deceptive behavior and truthful behavior
Certainly.
earlier in the food chain. It allows you to make a tremendous amount of return above what the market can do. But anyway, I don't quite know what all of the bits are, but that is one of them, is a fear of being replaced, a fear of being wrong. We were told by one of the largest auditors and most important auditors, and by auditors, I mean auditing firm and the individual in charge of Northeastern US audit for one of the largest accounting firms globally scaled. He said, I don't want my regulator to find out, based on your software, what I've been missing all these years. And so there's also that fear of that. Another quick story, we were talking to a venture capitalist, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a fun call for me because there was an old lion and a young lion, who are representing this venture capital firm. We were trying to get them to provide us capital in a venture capital setting. And he said, look, I think that your company is quite interesting. I can't quite get conviction about this, so we're going to pass on investment. I said, well, no problem. Thank you for your candid feedback. However, what about using us and becoming one of our clients? Because you could utilize this in venture cap because their judgment of management is everything, right? If you don't judge management well, that's bad. And he said the following. He goes, well, I wouldn't be a very good venture capitalist if I couldn't assess management well, which is a similar feedback I just referred to in a different setting. And the old lion hasn't said anything. This is the young lion the whole time. And I said, okay, I'll grant you that you may be very good at judging management as a venture capitalist, but now using our software, you can evaluate all the opportunities, including those that you passed up, and you can create norms and benchmarks. And you may be very good, but by measuring the capability using our software, you now have a benchmark. So then I can help coach you on ways that you could get better. And the young man goes, I don't know that I want that revealed. And the old guy started laughing because he recognized the BS of, again, bringing this whole conversation full circle. That young man's identity is wrapped up in, I evaluate management well. And so we basically bring a pin to that balloon and pop it. And people don't want to think that they could, potentially get better. As you know from Intuitive Investor, one of the things I teach is uh, know the bounds of your ignorance and track where you feel uncomfortable and anxious around your feelings of ignorance. This young man feels ignorant there, and every time he's ever gotten to that ignorant space, he's dialed it back and reassured himself he knows how to do this. We make people, to your point, Javier, very nervous and make it very obvious where that boundary is. And so I think you're probably right. That's one of the struggles that we've had
And
as an
you'll want them to
organization.
turn on the light.
Yeah, we want them to basically go, thank God for you pointing out where I'm ignorant, and thank God you're here because now I can grow as a person. I'm no longer constrained by my ignorance. With your software, I'm now that.
What do you see is the transition for the next 10 years? And what do you think people in general should be doing to prepare for that upset and for that transition? Should more
Great
people
question.
start investing in stocks
Yeah,
as a
great
living?
question. Yeah, so a great question that you've just asked. I think we are literally at the very nascent beginnings of a capability that we've never had before. And I've only seen one other thing in my career. I'm now 54 that's been like this, and this is the internet. And the benefit of the internet was it permanently lowered the cost of information discovery. It just did, right? So it is, if for those who are the economists in your audience, it permanently shifted a curve rather than a movement along a curve. It shifted a curve lower in terms of the cost of what it took to discover something. The thing that's the revolution now is a lot of activities that people have been engaged in are actually highly repetitive, like accounting, like investment management, where it's based on quantity, right? And now,
Quantity.
and there are already, and I track it on a daily basis, already papers where people have used freely available, publicly available ChatGPT for to make money in stocks greater than what professional investors are earning. It will only get better. But what it's not doing and what people aren't doing is evaluating what are the real sources of value in these businesses. And the revolution that's before us is the ability to quantify human behavior in a very profound way. We're evaluating deceptive and truthful behavior, but there's no reason you couldn't measure an executive's anxiety, their confidence, uh, their actual ability to match knowledge with application. You can measure all of these things already, but people have not built investing tools around them. But what this means is the thing that people should be focused on to carve out, going back to inspiration, imagination, thought, word, deed, the inspiration phase. What's most human about us? How do we use our inspiration, our insight to begin leveraging some of these tools in new and innovative ways? I also think that the gig economy, the ability to be an independently franchised human being, and coming together to solve business problems is a big threat to big corporations. They're just
It is.
not the huge economies of scale available to big companies unless they're distributing a physical good or product. But if your output is a knowledge-based product, you're gone. You're gone, right? There's no reason for those big
Just a
scale.
matter of time.
It's a matter of time. It's already here. It's already, the die is cast. And one of the things I know from my career and a piece of wisdom to impart is once the genie is out of the bottle on these things, it's not getting put back. People may
Exactly.
fight it tooth and nail. They may try and legislate it. They may try and compete against it. They may try and consolidate by buying the competitor that threatens them and undermines their business. They may try and buy it and then bury it, which some businesses do. The genie's out of the bottle on that one. It's basically over. It's just the question is, what is the size of the second derivative? Sorry to invoke calculus here, which is the rate of change.
Absolutely.
What is it's the first derivative is positive and impossible to undo. And the second derivative is also positive. The question is, how large is that rate of change? That's the only thing that's missing.
What should people be doing to prepare for it? Because if you, of course, you understand economics. So I'm not sure how versatile you, or how much you've studied, like for example, Austrian economics.
I
But it
have
talks
studied.
about that the fact that if things get cheaper because of the fact that you don't have to pay people, then people will be able to procure more goods. And perhaps we'll get to a situation like Eric Hoffer talked about, the Sabbath, where people don't really have to work and where
Yeah.
people can just do what they feel inspired to do. And the challenge of that's going to be finding meaning.
So you nailed it. I really like, and thank you for the question and thank you for the framing. So if people go to my LinkedIn profile, they'll see that I co-founded a think tank here in my hometown of Sarasota called the Sarasota Institute,
Well,
which we closed the doors of. But we used to think about this profoundly. And what is the net benefit of AI? The net benefit of AI is a lot of goods and services now are automated. What that means under current ways that the economy is structured is that those who own capital, not labor or land, are going to have huge and profound accumulations of capital. And that societally, here's a chronology. I don't know what I don't know what the timeline is down at the bottom, but this is the sequence of things that I think are likely to happen. Those capital owners are going to have huge agglomerations of capital in the trillions of dollars. And we already know who those players are. See Amazon, for example, see Apple, see Microsoft, and they've already been preparing for this.
behemoth.
Behemoth, like beyond. And at a certain point, that is going to become unpalatable to huge parts of the population because no matter how hard they work, no matter how much they meditate, no matter how inspired they are, their benefit economically as a non-capital owner, but as a labor owner, will be capped. And so there's going to be a moment existentially where culture globally has to ask itself, what do we do with this accumulation of capital? And that will be a fork in the road. Current economic thinking has treated capital as scarce. It's not scarce any longer. Capitalism only works if capital is more scarce than land or labor, and it's not. And so it breaks down as soon as there are these huge agglomerations of capital. And capital isn't scarce any longer. It's invented by the Federal Reserve or central banks. It's invented
Precisely.
by new great ideas. You could say that capitalism as a way of thinking about the world has been a huge and overwhelming success because capital is no longer scarce, and yet the economy continues to grow, and there aren't huge spirals of inflation, maybe. Anyway, I'm digressing. The fork in the road is, what do we do with this? Do we still use capitalism as our means of understanding, primary way of understanding the world and organizing the world economically? I don't think so. I don't know when it will be, probably not in my lifetime, but I can't imagine a future world in which it's more widely socially shared and there will be capital owners to whom we all owe something, right? Amazon still needs employees, but it'll be more widely distributed in the form of better transportation systems, more leisure time for people. People shouldn't be starving anymore in a situation like that. But that raises the big S word, socialism. And I'm not a socialist. It's just, you look at the natural conclusion of this, sans violent revolution and the seizing of that capital and the destruction of that capital, and what is a great good, if people aren't willing to share that, that's the outcome. And that's one of the global tensions right now is people feel it. People feel it. They feel that no matter how hard I work, I can't get ahead. And that's a lot of the social tension in the Western world is just that. The capital owners are going to have to like surrender some of that. How that happens, I don't know, but it could be a really beautiful, dare I say it, utopian future if we agglomerate capital through AI and through these other things. And there are people who work because they feel like they need to. But why do you need farmers any longer? You have an AI-enabled combine and planter and harvester. Like, almost everything can be
Precisely.
automated in this way. Why do you need people? Well,
So
people
the
have,
end of this is going to be a beautiful thing. It's just a question of what's going to happen from here to there.
yeah, the in
But
between is the unknown. If the climate survives, and I'm not a climate denier, the climate is suffering. If we are able to find a way to survive the climate thing, there is the possibility for this really beautiful world in which we don't really have to work. Or if we do work, we're working to contribute to an overall system of robotics driven by AI that does a lot of the old jobs. Yeah, it's a possibility for sure.
but
We
we
used to talk
still
about it.
remain human.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
good thing.
yeah.
So Jason Apollo Voss, I thank you so much for being on.
My
I
pleasure.
think we had an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Javier. Really appreciate your interest and curiosity. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with your group.